What did OCP do to the bodies of the 13 RoboCops? What major structural differences exist between the various versions of RoboCop created from Officer Murphy? Which transformation is the most absurd, which is the most agonizing, and which is the most shocking? The answers to these and other curious questions about the many RoboCops can be found in this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and support the video with your engagement. It really matters to me. RoboCop is not a single hero. Over the years, OCP created an entire lineup of cyborgs, and each of them went through its own series of experiments, anatomical modifications, and painful mistakes. In the RoboCop franchise universe, there are many different versions of RoboCop, but they are all united by one thing. First, they die, and then they are rebuilt. And very often, not everything works properly afterward. In this video, we'll break down the anatomical and cybernetic modifications of every RoboCop created on the basis of a human brain who appeared across the universe. Some will get more attention, some less. As always, it depends on how many details exist in the films and in the lore. But in any case, we'll cover every RoboCop shown in the movies, TV series, and certain comics. From the classic Murphy, in his various interpretations, to failed prototypes and experimental models. The 1987 film RoboCop became one of the best examples of sci-fi action cinema for a reason. The image of RoboCop, created from Officer Alex Murphy, became legendary. Slow, heavy, relentless, yet with lightning-fast reflexes that let him literally catch bullets in mid-air. I'm sure you remember how this story began. Officer Alex Murphy transferred to a new precinct in Detroit, and in his first shift, together with his partner Lewis, he was brutally killed by Clarence Bodica's gang. During the inhumane execution, they tore off his arm, and in the end, he was shot in the head by Bodica. But the brain stem was not damaged. That's why the officially dead Alex Murphy became the first and most successful subject in the implementation of the RoboCop project. This was a project by OCP, the corporation that practically controlled all of Detroit. Their goal was to create a machine capable of drastically reducing crime on the city streets. Their earlier attempts had failed, and at one point they decided that a human brain must become the foundation for the machine's artificial intelligence.
Your move, creep.
And let's answer the main question right away. The classic RoboCop, Alex Murphy, is he a human or a machine? He's rather a machine. As the classic RoboCop himself says, he's a program enhanced by the personal qualities of Officer Murphy, and this fully reflects his nature. His curiosity about his past life and family can be called exactly that. Curiosity, not emotional suffering. In the first film, he tells Lewis, "I can feel them, but I can't remember them." And this version of Murphy, unlike the 2014 version and other RoboCops, does not consider himself a monster. Psychologically, he has accepted himself as a RoboCop, and that apparently is the main secret of his stability. So what exactly remained of the former Officer Murphy in this new construction? We know the answer clearly. The creators of the film stated it themselves. From Officer Murphy, only the brain, most likely a small part of the spine, and the face remained. Specifically, only the skin. Under his face, there are no muscles or elements of human bone, only metal. This is confirmed by the scene in the second film. His eyes are completely artificial, and we often see his fully artificial jaw as well. If the skin were removed from his head, underneath we would see something resembling a Terminator-like skull. Such a head structure, where the amount of organic material, other than the brain, is reduced to a minimum, serves several purposes. The first is protection. The less organic matter there is in the head's construction, the lower the chance of critically damaging RoboCop. And Murphy's brain itself is the most protected part of his cybernetic anatomy. From the working script of the second film, we know that Cain's group tried to get to his brain, but they failed. The second reason is psychological. From the creator's commentary, we know that Murphy would eventually see his own head in a reflection without the helmet, and if he saw not his former face but exposed mechanisms or something like that, it could lead to a program psychological failure. And the third reason is the social integration of RoboCop in Detroit. Murphy's visual design is the most human-looking of all RoboCops. The citizens love Robo Murphy. After Officer Murphy's death, we are shown scenes of his transformation, and there we can notice one of the most important details. The engineers in the top management of OCP, when beginning the creation of the first RoboCop, did not yet know what he would ultimately look like. The very first shots show that his visual system could have originally looked something like this. But in the end, the engineers decided to return to a more human-like design and created those artificial eyes for Murphy. Also, initially, Murphy's construction could have preserved far more of his former organic parts. At the very least, at first the engineers tried to keep his left arm, but Bob Morton gave the order for full prosthetics. In the end, of all Murphy's former human organs, only the brain remained, packed with processes that, judging by everything, heat up quickly during operation. We can assume this from the ventilation openings visible on the head. And as I mentioned earlier, Murphy, just like Cain, may have retained a small fragment of his spine along with the spinal cord. There are two reasons for this. The first, naturally, is the neural connection between the brain and the new cybernetic body, but the second reason is far more important for OCP. The remnants of Murphy's former human nervous system allow RoboCop to feel pain. Why does OCP need this? After all, they could simply disable this function and make RoboCop even more efficient. But instead, we often see Murphy, already as a RoboCop, experiencing real physical pain. He suffers. Yes, it is important for OCP that all RoboCops can feel pain, because pain is precisely the tool that prevents RoboCop from resisting classified directives. For example, directives such as detaining high-ranking OCP managers. Logically, the engineers could have made it so that RoboCop simply shuts down in such situations, but apparently, the structure of the human brain imposes its own corrections. And so, instead of shutting down, RoboCop must suffer. Yes, the entire body of the classic Murphy, except for the brain and the patch of skin that forms his face, is completely artificial. His circulatory system is artificial, his digestive system is artificial, and his respiratory system as well. And yes, I believe he still has some analog of a respiratory system because his biological components require not only nutrients but also oxygenation. We also know for certain that the original Murphy has an internal power source, though we do not know exactly where it is located. The most logical placement is within the torso. In the second film, when Cain's group removed nearly all of Murphy's limbs, his consciousness, despite the agonizing pain, was still able to function.
I know every inch of him. His pain centers are alive!
Friends, next we'll move on to the alternative versions of Alex Murphy, each of which, nevertheless, has its own individual differences, including in cybernetic anatomy. If you want to hear much more information and detail about Peter Weller's Robo Murphy, there's a separate, very large video on my channel dedicated entirely to him. I'll leave a link at the end of this video. The 1994 Canadian series presents a RoboCop universe with a child-friendly rating. Essentially, this Alex Murphy has the same backstory, but here RoboCop is portrayed as a family-friendly superhero. In this version, RoboCop doesn't kill anyone. He often resolves conflicts not through force, but through moral monologues about kindness and doing the right thing. As if OCP decided to manufacture toys rather than RoboCops. Still, I think many of you are familiar with this show. Personally, I liked it as a kid, though it didn't air very often on our TV channels. In this series, Murphy received several technical upgrades that didn't exist in the films. He was given massive retractable spikes in his feet that let him anchor himself into the ground and withstand massive loads, for example, stopping a moving car. He also gained compartments for explosive projectiles, his Auto 9 was equipped with anti-tamper protection, and the data spike in his hand became a universal multifunction tool. But this is not what I want to focus on in this video. I want to draw special attention to episode 4 of the series. For context, the show only had one season. It was never renewed for a second. In this episode, Murphy is severely damaged after a confrontation with a criminal group, practically immobilized. The main problem is that one of the internal cables in his head, responsible for the connection between his brain and his mechanical systems, is damaged. A former engineer, once employed at a facility owned by OCP, takes on the job of repairing Murphy. OCP had shut down that facility in the past, leaving many workers unemployed, including this character. But he succeeds brilliantly and gets Murphy back on his feet. Yes, this episode is notable for showing Murphy's brain in full detail. Remember earlier when we talked about how the brain of the classic film version Murphy is extremely well protected? His head, especially the back of it, really looks like the most fortified part of his body. It gives the impression that accessing his brain would require specialized, specifically engineered tools. In the series, all of that is discarded. Opening access to the brain appears ridiculously easy. The metal forming the walls of his cranial casing is extremely thin, and look at the amount of empty space between the brain and the inner walls of the metal skull. This means that with any impact, even a minor one, Murphy's brain would rattle around inside like a ball inside a tin can. Nothing holds it in place, nothing cushions it, nothing stabilizes it. Even worse, the connection between his brain and his mechanical systems relies partly on thin, needle-like probes inserted into Murphy's brain. So if an impact caused the brain to collide with the walls of the metal casing, these needles could penetrate even deeper, inflicting further trauma. This creates a bizarre situation. The series version of RoboCop has sturdy armor, yet his single most vital organ is one of the most vulnerable parts of his anatomy. So in the case of the series, RoboCop OCP clearly messed up.
Are we cops?
RoboCop Prime Directives from 2001 is another Canadian miniseries about RoboCop. Darker, more mature, and more brutal. Here, Robo Murphy is an aging, worn-out, and in some ways morally broken cyborg who stopped being an OCP novelty a long time ago. Most of his systems have already exceeded their operational lifespan, and how he's still functioning is unclear. But in truth, we know the answer. It is the unshakable will of Alex Murphy, strange as that may sound. The first thing that stands out is the altered design of Murphy's head in the moments when we see him without the helmet. Naturally, this is due to budget constraints on special effects, but this version of Murphy does have anatomical differences from the classic one, and they are subtle. This Robo Murphy can have blood flow from his nose. Yes, this does not prove that his head contains more organic tissue than the original, because we know the original RoboCop also had an artificial circulatory system. But this version of RoboCop can cry, meaning he has functioning tear glands. And this means the head of this Murphy contains far more organic material than his predecessors, because producing tears requires soft tissues around the eye socket, a vascular network, nerves, lacrimal sacs, certain muscles, and so on. In other words, biologically, much more of this Murphy remains compared to the original brain and face skin configuration. Beneath his skin are most likely not metal plates, but muscles and bone. Yes, this Murphy is far more human than the earlier ones, and the simple fact that he can cry proves it. He is capable of experiencing nearly full human emotion. He's already more human than machine, and that matters. More importantly, he became this way with time. The more his mechanical body aged, the more of the human inside him resurfaced. And since we're speaking about the humanization of the classic RoboCop, I must mention the comic titled Frank Miller's RoboCop. For reference, Frank Miller was one of the screenwriters of the second film, and many of his ideas were also used in the third. And Frank Miller's RoboCop is essentially his full authorial version of what the second film's story should have been. On the technical side, there are also a few interesting details. Frank Miller finally revealed where RoboCop stores the magazines for his Auto 9. He keeps them in his forearms. There are also scenes where, after sustaining heavy damage, we see Robo in a disassembled state. The huge number of wires inside Murphy looks extremely futuristic. The wires inside Murphy's construction are his artificial nervous system connecting his brain to the prosthetic body. Looking at these illustrations, one can only marvel at how complex Murphy's nervous system truly is. But the most important thing in Frank Miller's interpretation is that this version of classic Murphy is the most human of all the ones we have discussed so far. Yes, he is also capable of crying, but beyond that, he's capable of feeling something for Lois. Their final meeting in the comic ends with him kissing her quite passionately. Understandably, Lois is stunned. Clearly, a man, not a machine.
Murphy, it's you.
And before we move too far from the 2001 series, we need to talk about John Cable. In the past, he was a cop and Alex Murphy's partner. They were friends and sometimes played chess together, but their paths split after one incident. Cable exceeded his authority and shot a criminal after the man no longer posed a threat. Murphy saw this as crossing a line and transferred to another precinct. Yes, according to the series, this is the actual reason Murphy transferred. Cable would later become entangled in a criminal conspiracy inside OCP, which incidentally involved his former wife. He would be killed and resurrected as a new RoboCop, Robo Cable. At first, he would be used by OCP and by third parties for their own purposes. And of course, the same control mechanism used on all RoboCops, Pain, would be used against him as well. But in the end, Cable would make the right choice, side with his former partner and sacrifice himself for the greater good. Technically, RoboCable is the same class of cyborg as the classic RoboCop, with the exception that his systems have not exceeded their operational lifespan. But he does have certain technical differences, and they were stated clearly in the series. Several of his primary sensory systems have been upgraded, especially his optical system. This is shown through his target acquisition interface. He can focus on 2 targets simultaneously, something Murphy cannot do. Because of this, Cable is equipped with 2 Auto 9s at once, and that is a very serious advantage, far greater firepower. The 2014 remake presented an alternative version of Alex Murphy's RoboCop. The CEO of Omnicop, Raymond Sellers, was determined to push a legislative initiative that would allow his fully automated enforcement units to be deployed onto the streets of American cities. But the public did not support this idea. At some point, he decided that Americans needed a symbol of the company, someone they could trust and even admire. And this symbol could not just be another robot, it had to be a human placed inside a machine. First a man, then a machine. Officially, this program was framed as a rehabilitation initiative for people, primarily for those with disabilities, who sought a second chance.
Holy Christ, there's nothing left.
Dr. Dennett Norton was responsible for the technical implementation of the project. And if we look at the expanded universe of the film, Alex Murphy was not the first test subject. The miniseries of comics RoboCop: The Human Element shows the story of a US soldier named Joshua Duncan, who was the first experimental, unsuccessful subject. He was killed in Iran by a gunshot wound to the head. After that, he regains consciousness in Dr. Norton's laboratory, where he's told he has been given a second chance. And most likely, Joshua will not be able to remember much about his previous life, as his brain was damaged. Omnicop places the resurrected Joshua back into his former unit. This decision enrages the general because Joshua is dead. Many of his fellow soldiers saw it. Robo-Joshua demonstrates extremely impressive combat performance, but he's tormented by nightmares in which a group of soldiers executes an innocent Iranian family. Gradually, Joshua loses his sanity and accuses his comrades, insisting that this is not a dream but a memory, that they really killed those innocent people and that he was there and witnessed it. His comrades tell him the truth. Those civilians died by his own hand and they tried to stop him. This is why he was shot. After hearing this, Joshua loses control and charges at a Net 209 with a weapon, fully aware that it will tear him apart. Sellers then orders that the fact of Joshua Duncan's resurrection be permanently concealed. Together with Norton, he decides never again to use soldiers as test subjects. An interesting detail is that apparently the only part of Joshua's original body that remained was his head, even though the rest of his body was completely intact. In the early stages of transformation, he resembled a Frankenstein-like monster. This is how Sellers described him. But the reason his body was replaced so drastically, just as in Murphy's case, is clear. Officially, Omnicop claimed to be creating a man placed inside a machine, but the combat capabilities of such a soldier were required not just to match, but to exceed the performance of fully automated units. For this reason, the replacement of organic matter with technology was maximized. And now, our familiar face, Alex Murphy, who, as we now understand, became the second test subject of the RoboCop program in the 2014 remake.
I don't want to see myself like this again. Ever.
Murphy crosses his corrupt colleagues who have been colluding with a criminal group. They stage an assassination attempt by planting a bomb in his car. As a result, 80% of his body is covered in burns. He loses his right arm and right leg. The lower half of his body is paralyzed, and both his hearing and vision are at serious risk. Murphy is expected to remain permanently disabled and confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. But Dr. Norton offers his wife the chance to enroll him in the rehabilitation program, and she agrees. This time, Omnicop clearly knew what Murphy's reconstructed body would look like, the maximum possible replacement with prosthetics. Therefore, preserving the right hand looks highly illogical. Essentially, they preserved only what was strictly necessary to maintain the function of the brain, which is packed with processes, namely the respiratory system, the heart, and the spine. The spine once again serves the purpose of providing a neural link between the brain and the mechanical body. This adaptation clearly demonstrates why RoboCops need remnants of the spine or spinal cord. In the moments when Murphy's spine was not activated, he existed inside his own fantasies. When Norton gave the command to connect the spine, Murphy began to regain consciousness and gradually feel his new body. Meaning that for RoboCop, as for any human, the spine provides the link between the brain and the body, whatever that body may be. The tissues of the head and face, including internal ones, were preserved as much as possible. To the public, this RoboCop needed to appear human. In addition, like the classic Murphy, he would eventually see his own reflection. He already experienced pure horror upon seeing what remained of him. If on top of that he had not seen his own face, things could have turned out far worse. Because in these moments, Murphy's personality is fully intact, he is completely self-aware. Perhaps this is why the right hand was preserved. When Murphy looks at his new body outside of a mirror, at least this way he sees something familiar. Yes, the psychological transformations of this Murphy proved far more difficult than the anatomical ones. He had to learn to accept his new self, and so did his family. The plot revolves around the fact that Norton, under Sellers' influence, gradually reduces the amount of humanity in Murphy's consciousness. First by upgrading his combat engagement system, then by lowering his dopamine production to the minimum. This essentially turns Murphy into an emotionless machine. Norton does this because after seeing the footage of the explosion, Murphy becomes fixated on that memory, which leads to an emotional malfunction. But despite all restrictions, the human side still begins to overpower the program. Why? Norton never finds an answer, but at one moment the film hints at the correct one, an idea some characters mock. A human has something a machine never will, a soul. And with that, we conclude the list of all versions of Alex Murphy shown in films and TV series.
Yeah, pretty good.
Now let's move on to the famous RoboCop 2 program, which played a major narrative role in the 1990 sequel. Not much time has passed since the events of the first film, yet OCP already considers the first RoboCop outdated and ineffective. Although in reality, no other OCP product has ever shown greater efficiency in fighting crime. Frank Miller's version of RoboCop, whose storyline, as a reminder, forms the foundation of the second film, explains OCP's dissatisfaction with the first RoboCop far more clearly. It's simple, Murphy often resisted OCP directives. Remember that the Detroit police force is owned directly by OCP, and RoboCop frequently refused to carry out orders that conflicted with the moral principles of Officer Murphy. For example, Murphy consistently refused to disperse striking workers of some shut-down factory, and so on. Therefore, the RoboCop 2 program did not take long to appear. First, the company's engineers present the Old Man, the head of OCP, with 2 experimental RoboCop prototypes. Both turned out to be failures. The first prototype is extremely bulky. It is notable for the fact that inside his torso they placed an entire human head, whose mouth is constantly open. Why? Apparently because this test subject is in continuous, excruciating pain, which is likely why he goes insane, shoots at personnel, and then shoots himself in the brain through an opening that realistically should not exist there. The second prototype is more interesting. It dies after removing its helmet, exposing a human skull stripped of soft tissue. Why this prototype even needs a human skull is unclear. Apparently the engineers were in a hurry and the design ended up incomplete. As far as I understand, this prototype dies because it destroys the neural interfaces embedded in its brain. It simply disconnects them. And this prototype is not the last time we see it. In the game RoboCop Rogue City, which is canonically set after the first 2 films, we see this RoboCop again, and now in multiple units, but this time without human brains, under the working designation Urban Enforcement Droid, UED. OCP top executive Max Becker decided that organic elements in RoboCops were nothing but an obstacle, and that fully automated drones were far more reliable and obedient. Over the course of 5 years, he refined his prototype and eventually intended to replace all Detroit police officers with mass-produced drones. In a sense, he succeeded in improving them, but in terms of combat efficiency, compared to Murphy, they are a failure. Although for certain purposes, of course, they may be suitable. Max Becker did not choose this prototype by accident. This model is significantly lighter and more compact than the others. Its construction is greatly simplified. Accordingly, it is far better suited for mass production, although originally this relative simplicity and the flaws in its design were merely the result of the engineer's rush. In Frank Miller's comic, we also see a couple of unusual prototypes, massive, imposing, and dangerous in their proportions. The head of one test subject was kept inside some kind of glass tank with numerous sensors connected directly to it. Another had large tubes running into his head, pumping some sort of fluid inside. These test subjects also went insane almost instantly, injuring those around them and desperately searching for ways to destroy themselves.
Specs, I'm afraid we lost our patient.
Dr. Juliet Fax, who in the sequel leads the search for a new candidate for the RoboCop 2 program, insists that it is pointless to keep looking for test subjects similar to Officer Murphy. Yes, those earlier subjects were also good cops, but their minds refused to accept themselves in this new role. There was something in Murphy's personality that made him unique and possibly one of a kind. And now they need a different type of subject. Someone who would be glad to accept themselves in the form of a monster, someone who would not be bound by moral principles, someone who craves power and dominance. In short, they need a complete psychopath, someone like Cain, a former leader of a major criminal organization that distributed prohibited substances across Detroit. And as it happens, he ends up in Juliet Fax's hands in critical condition. She forcibly disconnects him from life support and orders the medical staff to extract his brain as quickly as possible. Again, together with a section of the spine, and in this case, the eyes as well. The eyes are later discarded since RoboCain receives a new optical system. Perhaps the eyes were only needed so Cain could at least somehow perceive himself well confined in that tank. Biologically, what remains of Cain is almost identical to what remained of Murphy, and as with Murphy, pain is used as a method of control. Cain's dependence on prohibited substances forces him to obey and suffer whenever he does not receive his dose on time. I've always been amazed by the amount of substance they give Cain. It looks like enough nuke to get an entire district of Detroit addicted. From this comes a crazy theory. Perhaps this nuke also serves as partial fuel for RoboCain's cybernetic systems, and yes, this is likely too far-fetched. RoboCain's construction is monstrous. He was designed specifically to inspire genuine terror the moment he first appears. Despite his size, his construction allows him to be surprisingly agile. He can even move along vertical surfaces. He's also equipped with impressive firepower. The detailed, monstrous design of RoboCain had another practical purpose. OCP was not only interested in creating a single specialized RoboCop, but also in mass production with potential military collaboration. This is what they attempted with the Ad 209, and cyborgs similar to RoboCain, if successfully tested, could theoretically be produced on a large scale. But as you remember, this prototype also failed. You cannot place a monster inside a machine and then complain that the machine behaves like a monster. A dependent monster. At the beginning of the video, we mentioned that the most protected part of the classic Murphy's construction is his human brain. Cain himself in the first half of the film was unable to get to Murphy's brain, and the irony is that, in the end, Murphy was able to get to Cain's brain. In the construction of this monster, the protection of the brain turned out to be a weak point. Yes, Murphy is smaller and weaker than RoboCain, but he is far more resilient. I think you remember that the cyborg also appeared in the finale of RoboCop Rogue City, but this time the old man's brain was placed inside him. Beyond that, there are no significant differences. In Frank Miller's RoboCop, there was a different version of the final RoboCop 2. The cyborg was still huge and dangerous, but had a more anthropomorphic form. Inside it, they placed the brain of a sadistic mercenary nicknamed Kong, who also had a dependence on prohibited substances. However, the cyborg's addiction was never explored in the narrative. There were also scenes where an entire group of doctors extracted the brain of a resisting Kong. The medical staff asked Dr. Love, the prototype of Dr. Fax in the comic, for permission to use anesthesia, but she replied that he needed to feel everything, to accept reality. Later, however, Dr. Love uploads her own consciousness into the cyborg, meaning that in the finale, Murphy and Lewis fight the virtual consciousness of Dr. Love uploaded into the machine. Eventually, Lewis finishes her off with a rocket launcher shot, just moments before Murphy kisses her and disappears from sight. The story ends with Murphy, now freed from all directives, leaving the police precinct. Technically, he's no longer an officer, but an independent protector of Detroit. I hope you learned much more about the various RoboCops today. If you enjoyed this video, support it with your engagement and a subscription to the channel. It really matters to me. Goodbye!